Welcome everyone to my chat on coffee, and is it actually a wonder nutrient? Well, there's much to know about coffee, and we're going to be reviewing some of the historical perspectives on coffee and some of the most up-to-date research that gives us a really good idea of whether we should be drinking coffee or not. And generally, it is a resounding yes, we should be drinking coffee. So don't go worrying just yet, because there's plenty of research to support my argument that we all need to be drinking coffee for better health. Now, this might be the most famous coffee drinker. I don't know if anybody knows who it is, but it is the French writer Honoré de Balzac, who was well known for drinking over 50 cups of coffee a day. Unfortunately, Honoré de Balzac didn't actually live very long. He died at 51, and some people might suggest that his drinking of coffee might be the factor. But what was problematic for this guy he would often wake up at 1 o'clock in the morning, start drinking coffee, and work through the night. And we certainly know that circadian upsets for many people that we see in pilots or nurses can contribute to people's ill health. But he was such a big fan of coffee, and you can see from this famous quote here what coffee used to do for him. So we probably don't need to be drinking 50 cups of coffee. But there's certainly a sweet spot that we do need to consider to get the benefits from caffeine. Now, over 120 years ago or so, this guy, Eli Metchnikoff, who was an immunologist, zoologist, embryologist, he's been described at, he won the Nobel Science Prize in 1906 for his work on gut health, phagocytosis, immunology, and a broad overview of science and how biology tends to be affected by our ability to fend off against certain bacteria. And he found that people that were constipated generally had more issues because of this concept of putrefaction. Now, what was interesting in his book, The Prolongation of Life, he found he was reviewing the lifespan of centenarians, and he quotes Voltaire, the famous philosopher, who upon going to his doctor said, "Coffee is poisoning you," and in his late 90s, and he lived into his hundreds, Voltaire, said, "Well, I've been poisoning myself for over 80 years and I'll continue to do so." Metchnikoff also quoted another lady who lived to the ripe old age of 120 called Elizabeth Diro, and she lived in Savoy in France. She lived to the age of 114, and she was known to drink up to 40 cups of coffee, and her coffee pot would always be on. So we have some nice anecdotal evidence on coffee being drunk in people who've had increased lifespan. And there are a number of reasons from a digestive perspective why caffeine could be quite protective. It certainly seems to act as an antibacterial agent and protects against the enterobacter within the digestive tract. Therefore, it probably helps to lower bowel products of endotoxin. There's certainly a number of studies that have shown that both colon and liver are extremely well protected when people drink coffee. In non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, there's quite an abundance of research that it reduces fibrosis for those who are used to drinking a couple of cups or more. Caffeine can have an effect. It does contain small amounts of serotonin, but it also can have an effect on our smooth muscle tissue, and it can help to contract muscle tissue and also relax it, depending on the state of what's going on. It also has suggested holding elements of fiber and prebiotics, but generally as a rule of thumb, because it stimulates the bowel to function, enhances aerobic metabolism and energy, it can have a nice energetic effect on the bowel, and that's generally why coffee is pretty protective for bowel function overall. Now, caffeine tends to have a bad rap, but in context with other compounds and fluids like water, for example, we know that there are certain doses, just like Paracelsus said, the dose makes the poison. So with 6 litres of water, we're actually going to be in a very bad state. We're suffering from hyponatremia, passing out of excess amounts of sodium, and generally people that drink these large amounts of water will generally be on their way to the doctors or the mortuary pretty quickly. With caffeine, we're talking around about 118 cups of coffee will kill you. I've read somewhere around about 77 shots should do the trick as well. So probably somewhere between 70 and 120, you're going to be experiencing some pretty negative effects. The theory also is that 13 shots of alcohol, of whiskey in one go will also kill you. I probably know some friends who've managed to survive that, although felt somewhat worse the next day for sure. So we need to take caffeine in context with all the things that it does. It provides protection protection for our hormones and how they function. It induces protection against metabolism. It certainly shows very protective features against our central nervous system, and it also helps to enhance blood sugar regulation, and has also been shown to lower high blood pressure as well. It probably acts in concert with some of the other protective hormones like thyroid, progesterone, and other compounds like carbon dioxide. A lot of people have often cited caffeine as being a diuretic. Now, this has been pretty much debunked. In a study by Zhang et al. In 2015, the conclusion from the study that yes, caffeine exerted a very small minor diuretic effect, but if you exercise, this diuretic effect was lost. So there can be a small amount of extra fluid lost if you're a sedentary person, but those people that exercise, caffeine has no diuretic effect at all. So you can proceed and look at getting your water intake from the day from having some of your caffeine. Generally, as a rule of thumb, I work with clients and I suggest no more than a litre a day, because the water that we're going to get from coffee, tea and other foods is going to be usually enough to give us enough fluids throughout the day. Unless you are in a high heat environment where you need extra water, generally that should do most people, particularly if you're trying to improve your metabolic rate. Ingesting large amounts of water means that the body will have to heat that water up. You end up often passing out a lot more sodium. So about a litre a day will be fine for most people. Now, there are actually over 1,000 different chemical compounds in coffee. Interestingly enough, out of the 850 or volatile compounds found, only 40 actually contribute to the aroma of the coffee, and that can be a variety of things like the bitterness and the other aromas. Caffeine is the most protective compound that seems to be in coffee as well. And interestingly enough, there's only about 1 or 2% of caffeine within your coffee drink. There are other things like carbohydrates and lipids. We find other compounds like chlorogenic acids, the diterpenes, which have been associated with cholesterol increases, which we'll cover later. Certainly the polyphenols and antioxidant effects are well known. Magnesium, which is another essential nutrient that helps to lower our overall stress levels and contributes to lower sensitivities related to food. B1 or thiamine is intimately related to our oxidative metabolism, and we're going to be looking at the protective effects of aerobic metabolism. And generally, we can see from all of the issues and main benefits associated with caffeine, it has a broad protective effect across most aspects of function. What I want to consider now is that some coffees don't tend to be as protective as they seem. So is all coffee created equal? Well, actually, it seems it's not. Because in a study by Koutsopoulos in 2018, what they found was that women that drank instant coffee over a 10-year period had an adjusted odds ratio of 1.1. That means they were 48% more likely to get breast cancer than those that drank regular coffee. Interestingly enough, that those who drank regular brewed coffee had an adjusted odds ratio of 0.48, and there was generally a protective risk conferred to those that drank coffee. But instant coffee, probably because of the chemicals and other compounds that can disrupt biology, probably are the main reason why women are more prone to developing breast cancer. And that rings true with any exposure to large amounts of pollutants over time. One of the benefits of coffee as well is they actually decreased the amount of estrogen that was available by increasing the amount of sex hormone binding globulin, and also maintained and increased protected levels of progesterone. So overall, from a breast cancer perspective, coffee does seem to be very, very protective. And there can be sweet spots across all aspects of disease that should give us an optimal amount of coffee throughout the day. In the most recent analysis by Kim et al. In 2019, there was found that generally there was an inverse relationship between coffee consumption and all-cause mortality. Well, what does that mean? Well, generally the higher amount of coffee that you drank with a certain sweet spot meant that you were less likely to die from most of the diseases that we tend to be exposed to, such as heart disease, neurological dysfunction, and cancer. Here we can see that under 60 years of age, the relative risk decreases substantially after 1 cup of coffee, and around about that 2, 3, 4 mark tends to have the lowest effect. There can be some gains from the higher amounts of coffee, but I think generally overall the research has suggested that sweet spot between 2 to 4, perhaps even 5 cups. The all-cause mortality, obviously above 60 years, we tend to be more prone to disease and dying from certain diseases at any time. Obviously, we don't see as much as a decreased sweet spot or decreased risk from drinking 1 or 2 cups of coffee, but it's certainly much lower, which means the risk is reduced. The relative risk means that when we hit 1, there is a real risk and an increase of dying from any of those diseases. But still, if you're above 60 years of age, there's still a dramatic risk reduction from having between 2 to 4 and perhaps even 5 cups of coffee a day. And that's across all causes of specific deaths. In that meta-analysis, you can see up to, I think it was about just under 4 million people were reviewed, and there were 450,000 specific deaths of all-cause mortality, and the coffee drinkers seem to confer the most protection. So this is why drinking coffee can be extremely protective for everybody. Now, one of the main reasons that coffee is so protective for us is that caffeine, not only does it act as a metabolic stimulant, the way that it works, it improves our aerobic metabolism. Now, some of you may have seen this diagram before, but it's essentially our electron transport chain. So we have phases 1 through to 4. And at the end where we have cytochrome C and cytochrome C oxidase, this is sometimes one of the aspects of the aerobic system that's knocked out through high levels of pollution, high levels of stress. And what coffee does, it improves that action of cytochrome C and improves the aerobic system to function so that the end product is adenosine triphosphate, our energy currency, or ATP. It produces water and it produces carbon dioxide, specifically when we have adequate carbohydrates available. So in cancer, for example, estrogen is well known to lock out all aspects of the electron transport chain. Previously, physiologists like Albert St. Georgi, who did a lot of work on this, showed that there were protective compounds like methylene blue which could restore the whole of the electron transport chain. But equally, caffeine tends to restore that phase 4. So one of the many benefits of caffeine is an anti-carcinogen because it helps to restore aerobic metabolism, increases the ability to utilize carbohydrate, and increase the metabolic flexibility that's often lost when we lose the ability to utilize carbohydrates as a fuel, and we often get stuck in a degradation of just burning fats as a fuel, and they're problematic compounds. So coffee, again, it seems to be a very potent cell protector, but there are caveats to this, and sometimes when we put too much caffeine into the system, we are going to be exposed to problems because we don't have any available energy, and we're going to discuss that shortly. There also seems to be a large amount of research that shows that coffee is protective within diseases like Parkinson's, Alzheimer's and dementia. I'm actually working with a client in New Zealand at the moment who has had Parkinson's for 12 years and hasn't been drinking coffee. And amongst other issues of putting restorative compounds in like methylene blue and pregnenolone, we've actually got him drinking coffee. Now, this guy wasn't going to toilet every day. He was going to toilet once every 5 days, which is problematic because we end up absorbing some of the compounds and chemicals, and this can be extremely problematic because these factors can cross back into the bloodstream again and cause a variety of problems. But now he's going to toilet every single day. His energy's improved, his voice has improved, his clarity and energy have improved, and this is part of coffee being in his dietary strategy now, amongst other things. So the research that's out there, it shows that Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, dementias, people tend to have more protection conferred. In another study that came out, a meta-analysis in 2018, which the reference is in the back, showed that this was published in the New Zealand and Australia Psychiatry Journal. It basically found that depression risk was reduced by 8% per cup of coffee. That means for those drinking 4 cups of coffee a day had a decreased risk of depression that extended to 32%. So that's extremely important. And when we think about the last slide about how coffee improves the aerobic system, we can't dispute the beneficial effects of energy and metabolism and how that affects the central nervous system, also by upregulating features of thyroid function and progesterone, which are both protective to the neurological and central nervous system. Often what's been suggested that's a negative feature, and there are plenty of studies that suggest that caffeine decreases bone mineral density and may increase the risk of osteoporosis. But more recent studies have countered this. And in a large meta-analysis, not as a huge study, but people from a study of Cheng et al. That were originally evaluated in 2006, there were 6,000 participants in a study. I mean, back in 2014, over 5,000 of them were followed up. And there it was basically found that those that drank coffee, particularly postmenopausal women, had higher T-scores. Now, our T-score is our bone score, density score. So it's found that those that drank coffee had a higher T-score and ultimately bone density. And that's particularly protective for a lot of people across the board in both men and females. Now, for example, with coffee and cholesterol, it's often been suggested that the diterpenes that are found in caffeine elevate cholesterol. Now, when we kind of look at the nitty-gritty of this research, I'm not sure that it actually really matters. Cholesterol sometimes increases when we have a need for protection, to produce more tissue, and certainly involved in as an anti-inflammatory reaction. We know that our thyroid hormone increases cholesterol because we're unable to process cholesterol in the liver. The cholesterol receptor is also decreased. But ultimately, the compounds in the diterpenes, such as cafesol and carol, actually only increase the cholesterol by 0.33 millimoles, and triglycerides about 0.2. Now, triglycerides can come around and increase generally when we don't have enough energy available. But I do think that the cholesterol and coffee issue is generally negated. It's not statistically significant, and probably, given that it's so protective across all other domains, is probably just showing optimal cholesterol levels being present within tissues and the body. Now, an interesting thing about sugar is that for a lot of the purists who like to make coffee, for example, is that it should be as black and left on its own to get the most taste out of it. Now, this is extremely problematic for some, because when you drink coffee on its own, let's say, for example, the first thing in the morning you do is you throw coffee into the system. Now, you're often in a fasted state. For some people, they haven't eaten for 10 to 12 hours. Now, if you don't have enough energy available, it's like revving the engine, sticking nitric oxide into a tank that doesn't have any fuel. It's going to make a lot of noise, but it's not going to go anywhere. Therefore, the benefits of coffee are generally energy dependent. Sugar does not cause cancer. Sugar is not addictive. Sugar is used by a cancer cell, but then sugar is also used by any healthy cell because it's an efficient form of energy production. Therefore, to reap the benefits of coffee, you need to be having it ideally with food. And if you can't have it with food, you want to have it as a snack in between a meal, make sure that you do have sugar or milk. And we'll be talking about milk shortly as well. But generally avoiding coffee in a fasted state will avoid the upregulation of the stress hormones, which are often increased by activation of the adrenal glands. Now, as we get stressed from a blood sugar perspective, if we don't have any energy available, you're putting black coffee into the mix. It will stimulate the response of the production of adrenaline, cortisol, and the need to liberate energy from stored fatty acids. Coffee will often have more beneficial effects when it has a base of glucose to work from. And that's true for a number of hormones as well, like progesterone and thyroid, for example. So the more stress that we have from activating our adrenal glands, the more suppression we have of our thyroid, which is our key hormone of metabolism. So adding sugar in the mix can be extremely protective, and I'd certainly recommend it to people who are wanting to drink coffee in between meals. Now, from a sleep perspective, It's well known that coffee can disrupt sleep, and primarily because it has an antagonistic effect with the hormone adenosine. Now, adenosine is our key hormone that is used in the onset of sleep latency. The reason that the first part of sleep, that bit where we go into a slumber, then ultimately head towards our REM phase, or our rapid eye movement phase. Now, for some people, depending on their biology, their ability to metabolize caffeine, having a coffee after 4 o'clock, 3 or 4 o'clock is problematic because coffee has a half-life of about 6 to 8 hours. And generally, if you're having a hard time, your energy's low, and you've been kind of running around trying to support your body's functions via caffeine, you're probably going to find a negative effect. And this can have a negative effect throughout sleep as well. So, for example, one of the reasons we find it hard to get to sleep is because we're producing too much adrenaline and cortisol. So making sure you have your caffeine earlier on in the day is extremely important. Making sure you have it with enough energy is extremely important. Now, one of the things that tends to happen with sleep, as you can start to see in the slide on the left, the circadian cortisol profile, is that cortisol tends to start rising at around about 2 o'clock in the morning. Why? Because if you've eaten about 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning, in the evening, you've gone through about 6 or 7 hours there of using up your blood sugar stores and your liver sugar stores. So cortisol starts to increase as a response to decreasing blood sugar and sugar availability. Now, what will start to happen is we'll start to increase the synthesis of fatty acids to be converted to glucose for metabolism. So one of the reasons that people don't tend to sleep that well is because of the need to liberate energy from fats. And you can understand that increasing the amount of adrenaline and cortisol is something that might be waking you up as well. Interestingly enough, that some of the things that wake you up are serotonin and histamine. They bring you out of your deep phase of sleep. And often when we have ongoing intestinal inflammation, poor blood sugar regulation, propping ourselves up with caffeine without having the appropriate energy stores, this can be the main reason why people don't sleep that well. But it can improve, and coffee can be part of that, provided we stick to the concept of having adequate energy available and not having caffeine after a certain time. Now, dairy can be used as well within coffee as well. Unfortunately, the dogma around dairy is just as high as it is with coffee and sugar. Dairy does not cause cancer as well. I'll concede that quality of animals and the way that they're treated can have a significant effect on the quality of the milk. Cows should generally be grass-fed. Now, there have even been cases in certain countries where in industrialized farm units where some animals have been fed things like concrete powder, cardboard boxes, and even feeding animals things like maize and soy can be problematic to the quality of the milk. So getting grass-fed milk is always ideal. But generally, most people who say they have an issue with dairy, it isn't the dairy's fault, it's usually the person themselves, much like it is with the coffee. It's not the coffee's fault, it's the person's fault, because they can't handle the effects based upon their biology at that time. So often when we get inflamed, we have a lot of digestive distress. If you just hold your fingers up now and wiggle them around, that's what the intestines look like, and that's the microvilli. Sometimes the lacteals, which are the lactase producing components of the gut which break down lactose, are damaged, and that can be a reason why we don't have a good time with or good relationship with dairy as well. One of the other things that we should be concerned about is the tryptophan. Tryptophan is an amino acid. It's quite a problematic amino acid, and for many of you who've consumed whey products before, you might find that this is a key promoter of intestinal inflammation. Now, tryptophan, interestingly enough, is the precursor to serotonin. Serotonin is produced mostly in the bowel and is associated with increased inflammation. So if we're consuming large amounts of tryptophan and can't readily metabolize it, we can expect to see increased production of serotonin and histamine, and this can be extremely problematic. Often adding more glycine into the diet, more bone broth, more gelatin, marshmallows, for example, all contain quite high amounts of the protective amounts of glycine. It's the same concept with muscle meats, which contain tryptophan as well, and that's why having these other amino acids can help to negate the negative effects of excess amounts of tryptophan. Increasingly in products like cream and other dairy products, we see more intestinal inflammation compounds like carrageenan, which is Irish sea moss, guar gums, locust bean gum, Arabic gum, and all of these can contribute to the inflammation associated with dairy. I recently had a client who said she had a really hard time eating ice cream and she felt lousy. And I asked her to send me the ingredients, and lo and behold, there were 3 different types of gums that were used as preservatives and stabilizers, and they were the compounds that were actually irritating her. It wasn't the ice cream, and people shouldn't generally react to what is essentially milk, sugar, eggs, and cream. So, even plopping a bit of ice cream into your coffee and having a nice Italian affogato might be a step in the right direction for you to liberate the benefits of caffeine, and making sure that the dairy and the ice cream stuff that you have doesn't contain these additives. So in summary, caffeine is protective across most domains of biology and health function, like neurological dysfunction associated with Alzheimer's, dementia, and Parkinson's, certainly as an anti-cancer agent, certainly as a blood sugar protector, certainly as a blood pressure protector. But remember, the context is key to get all of these benefits. Ramping up caffeine throughout the day without having adequate available energy, not having it with foodstuffs, not having it with sugar or milk is going to be problematic for many people. And even having it with meat can have the beneficial effects of preventing the absorption of heavy metals like mercury. The sweet spot for most people is 2 to 5 cups per day. If you do find that caffeine has that irritating effect, think about, are you having an excess amount of caffeine? Are you having it with the right appropriate amounts of energy? And you'll generally find that caffeine is one of the most potent food compounds that we can have to protect your biology. Hope you found that presentation really useful. Any questions or problems and you'd like to get back to me with any observations, please feel free to send me an email. Thanks.